There is a version of this story where a 7'3" kid from Cavite becomes the answer to 40 years of Filipino basketball longing, and there is the version we actually got, which is messier, more human, and in its own way more interesting. In 2019, a 16-year-old Kai Sotto left home to chase a dream that had eluded every talented big man this country had ever produced, a real path to the pinnacle of the sport. 6 years later, in the second and third windows of the 2027 FIBA World Cup Asian Qualifiers, Gilas Pilipinas lost 4 straight games without him, capped by a 92-49 defeat in Perth that stands, by any honest measure, as the program's worst beating since it was rebuilt from the ground up back in 2009. And almost immediately, the conversation turned toward the big man who wasn't there. That instinct is understandable. It is also, when you sit with the film and the roster sheets and the injury reports, largely wrong. I have watched a lot of national teams lose a lot of winnable games. I covered the O2 Worlds. I sat in the stands in Manila when this program still measured success by how close it could get to Yao Ming's China, not by whether it could beat New Zealand at home. So when I tell you that blaming Kai Sotto for what happened this summer is a category error, I am not being charitable. I am being precise. Gilas Pilipinas went 2-4 in Group A of these qualifiers. 2 of those losses came before anyone even asked Sotto to report. The other 2 came with a hobbled roster and a naturalized star, Justin Brownlee, who couldn't put on a jersey in the worst of them. Somewhere in the difference between what Gilas hoped to be and what Gilas actually was this window, there is a real story. It just isn't the one everybody wants to tell. Start with the timeline, because the timeline matters more than the outrage. Sotto tore his ACL in January of 2025. That is not a bruise. That is not a tweak you play through for national pride. That is a year, sometimes closer to 18 months, of rebuilding a knee joint that has to support a 7'3" frame doing violent, explosive things on a hardwood floor for a living. He came back to action with the Koshigaya Alphas in Japan's B.League only recently, still working his conditioning up from nothing. His employer, understandably, was not eager to see a year of rehabilitation risked in a qualifying window against physical, grinding competition an ocean away from the paycheck that is actually funding that recovery. People wanted to hear that Kai chose comfort over country. What actually happened was a club protecting an asset that had just survived a catastrophic injury, in a sport where contracts, not patriotism, pay the rehab bills. So Gilas opened its second window at home, in Manila, without him. On February 26th, the New Zealand Tall Blacks came into Mall of Asia Arena and left with a 69-66 win, New Zealand's third straight over the Philippines, all 3 coming in the years since Sotto's body betrayed him. 4 days later, Australia followed, the Boomers, ranked 6th in the entire world, and the margin widened to 93-66, their first visit to Manila since the ugly, infamous brawl of 2018, though this time the damage was done entirely on the scoreboard. Judd Flavel, the New Zealand coach, said the quiet part out loud after that first defeat. His team knew exactly what it was up against without the 7-footer patrolling the paint, and they attacked accordingly, hunting mismatches, drawing Gilas's bigs into drop coverage, letting size do what size does. New Zealand improved to 7-1 all-time against the Philippines in that stretch. It is worth remembering that the lone win in that ledger, a 93-89 upset back in 2022, belonged to Kai Sotto. 19 points, 10 rebounds, 7 assists. The first time this country had ever beaten New Zealand in FIBA competition, and he was the reason why. That is not a footnote. That is the ghost in the room every time this team takes the floor without him. Then came July, and the third window, and here is where the conversation should have shifted but didn't. Gilas traveled to Auckland on the 3rd and lost a double overtime heartbreaker, 106-102, a game that actually showed some fight, some resolve, some evidence that this young core could hang with a ranked opponent on the road. 3 days later in Perth, at RAC Arena, the roof caved in. 92-49. Not one Filipino player reached double figures. Gilas trailed 33-14 after the first quarter and 41-27 at the break, and the second half simply buried them further. That is the heaviest defeat this program has absorbed since it reorganized itself in 2009, and it happened not because Kai Sotto stayed in Japan, but because Justin Brownlee, the very engine this offense has leaned on since Sotto went down, couldn't suit up at all, sidelined by a hamstring strain and peroneal tendinopathy that had been building since that grueling double overtime affair 3 nights earlier. Junmar Fajardo, 9 times the most valuable player of the PBA and still, at this stage of his career, the most disciplined interior mind this country has ever produced, gave what he had: 8 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 blocks. Mike Phillips added 6 and 12 boards. It wasn't enough, and it was never going to be enough, not against a Boomers team that ran the table at 6-0 in the group, with Bryce Cotton, the newly naturalized guard fresh off an NBA prove-it stint, hitting shots in bunches, and Tyrese Proctor orchestrating with the poise of a much older player. Here's what should trouble you if you actually love this team. The collapse in Perth happened with the exact same absence, Kai Sotto, that has now defined 4 straight defeats, and yet the single game with the widest margin of loss was the one where the second engine, Brownlee, also disappeared. That is not a coincidence you can wave away. That is a roster that has one true offensive first option and one true defensive anchor in its recent history, and when either one goes missing, the machine sputters. When both go missing on the same night, the machine doesn't sputter. It stalls completely, and you get a 43-point margin that will sit in the program's history books for a long time. Let's talk about the system, because Tim Cohn's triangle offense is built on principles that reward continuity, spacing, and a dependable low-post option who can either score one-on-one or read the double team and find the cutter. That is precisely what Sotto, at his best, provides: someone with the mobility to face up smaller defenders and the length to shoot over bigger ones. Without him, the pivot point of that offense has shifted awkwardly toward Quinton Milora-Brown, a serviceable passer and screener but not the same live scoring threat, which means defenses can sag off him and clog the driving lanes that used to open up around a true post scorer. The burden then falls on Brownlee to create individually rather than let the read and react system generate advantages organically. When Brownlee is healthy, that burden is survivable, even impressive at times. When Brownlee is hurt, as he was in Perth, there is no answer left on the bench, and you watch a team of talented young players, Dwight Ramos, Kevin Kiambao, Juan Gomez de Leano, Carl Tamayo, A.J. Edu, try to fill a hole that simply cannot be filled by committee against a defense as physical and well-coached as Australia's. Consider the shooting numbers across this stretch, because they tell a story of confidence eroding in real time. Gilas finished 10th in scoring at the most recent FIBA Asia Cup, averaging 78.8 points a night, respectable enough. In these consecutive qualifying losses at home, that number cratered to 66 points on 33.3% shooting. Ramos, in the Auckland defeat, went 6 for 21 from the field and 1 for 10 from distance, the shot profile of a player pressing, trying to manufacture what the system used to generate for him. That is what happens to shooters when the gravity around them disappears. Oftana, regarded as a knockdown threat in the PBA, has seen that same efficiency fail to travel internationally, whether because of shorter closeouts, unfamiliar physicality, or simply a rhythm that hasn't found its footing on this stage. None of that is Kai Sotto's failure. It's a supporting cast discovering, in real time and on the road, how much heavier the ball gets when your two best offensive weapons are compromised or absent. The rebounding numbers are just as damning, and just as revealing. Against the Boomers in the earlier home meeting, Gilas lost the glass battle 50-39, a gap that manufactured extra scoring chances Australia simply did not need to earn twice. Against New Zealand, across 3 consecutive losses now, the same story repeats, the tall blacks controlling the defensive glass, ending possessions clean, denying second-chance opportunities that a healthy, 7'3" shot blocker used to manufacture on the other end. Sotto, in his last extended run of Asia Cup qualifier play before the injury, ranked second in the entire competition in rebounding at 12.5 boards a night. Take that number away from a front court that already leans on aging legs and hopeful youth, and the math does what math does. It doesn't lie, and it doesn't care how much heart a team plays with. There's a piece of this story that lives outside the box score entirely, and it deserves to be said plainly. In the hours after the double overtime loss to New Zealand, Filipino fans and even a former PBA commissioner publicly wondered aloud whether Kai Sotto's commitment to the national program was in question, invoking the example of Nikola Jokic suiting up for Serbia despite his NBA obligations. It is a comparison that flatters the sentiment and ignores the medicine. Jokic was healthy. Sotto, at the time these comparisons were being drawn, was a year removed from a torn ACL, working his way back into game shape on a foreign league roster that had every financial reason to be cautious. Asking a recovering athlete to risk a second catastrophic injury for a qualifying window his team was always going to survive without him. Gilas had, after all, already clinched passage to the second round regardless of these results, is not the same conversation as asking a healthy superstar to show up for his country. Conflating the two does a disservice to both men, and it lets the actual, fixable problems in this program hide behind a much easier villain. So where does that leave Gilas Pilipinas? And where does it leave the young man everyone keeps invoking without inviting him into the room? The Philippines finishes the first round at 2-4, third in Group A, behind an undefeated Australia and a New Zealand side sitting at 4-2. That record carries forward into the second round in August, where Gilas will face Jordan, Iran, and Syria for what amounts to the last realistic path to an outright World Cup berth, a group stacked with Middle Eastern programs that have spent this same qualifying cycle building continuity of their own. Whether Sotto answers that call is still, as of this writing, an open question, one tied as much to his club's tolerance for risk as to his own resolve. What isn't open to question is what his presence has historically meant on both ends of the floor: the rebounding, the rim protection, the gravity that bends a defense's shape before a single possession even begins. There is a longer arc here, and it runs well beyond one brutal night in Perth. Gilas Pilipinas has spent the better part of a decade trying to answer a question this country has asked since the days when a 5'9" backcourt was enough to compete in Asia but never enough to compete with the world. Can the Philippines produce and sustain genuine size at the international level? Sotto was supposed to be the answer, and in flashes against New Zealand in 2022, he was exactly that. But careers built around 7'3" frames are fragile by nature, and the ACL tear that has cost this program 4 straight qualifying losses is a reminder that even the most promising basketball hope in a generation cannot outrun the physics of his own body. The next 5 years will not be defined by whether Kai Sotto plays every window. They will be defined by whether Tim Cone and the Samahang Basketball in Pilipinas can build a program sturdy enough to survive the windows when he can't, a deeper frontcourt rotation, a shooting core that doesn't wilt the moment the spacing tightens, a system that bends without breaking when its best pieces are unavailable. Because here is the uncomfortable truth this summer forced into the open. A program cannot be built around the health of one irreplaceable body, no matter how gifted that body is. Kai Sotto did not lose these 4 games. A roster stretched thin, a naturalized star who couldn't walk onto the floor when it mattered most, and an offense that has not yet found its second gear lost these 4 games. The kid from Cavite is still rehabbing a knee an ocean away, still carrying the weight of a nation's basketball ambitions on shoulders that, for one more window, simply weren't ready to bear it. Whether he ever returns to that stage healthy enough to finish what he started in 2022 remains the single most consequential question in Philippine basketball. But blame is a lazy substitute for patience, and patience, historically, is the one thing this program has never quite learned to offer its most talented son.